the objective of this session is really to set the tone and the focus of the evaluation week. And to start this, I would like to please introduce Madam Karen Rothminsterman, who is the Evaluator General of IDEV. She was previously the Division Manager for Knowledge Management, Outreach and Capacity Development since 2014. And she has been, for you who have attended this evaluation week before, as you know, at the forefront of the organization of IDEV Evaluation Week. Prior to being into IDEV, she has worked at the Resource Mobilization Department of the bank, and she was responsible for the 3-yearly replenishment process of the African Development Fund and the allocation of ADF resources to African countries. Karen was recently appointed as Evaluator General in April 2022, and she is the leading force orchestrating the successes of IDEV in the past few years. It is therefore my great honor to invite her, Karen, please, to share her welcoming remark.
Today, it warms my heart to see you join us for the AfDB's Development Evaluation Week 2022. Allow me to extend a big welcome to all of you from the entire African Development Bank, and especially from Independent Development Evaluation. This year's theme, Building a Stronger and More Resilient Africa, follows on from the discussions we had during the 2020 Evaluation Week, where we identified how effective learning from evaluations is linked to the delivery of sustainable development results. Key among the topics discussed was the need for institutions to learn from evaluations and for these lessons to inform development policies, strategies, and programs going forward. I'm glad to share with you that this is a practice we have taken on passionately here at the AfDB. Over the past 42 years, knowledge from the 2,380 evaluations conducted across the bank has been used in developing its policies, strategies, frameworks, processes, and operations. In 2021, for example, IDEV's independent evaluations have informed new bank policies and strategies in the areas of water, climate change and green growth, private sector development, assessing additionality and development outcomes, public-private partnerships, sustainable borrowing, trust funds, sovereign operations restructuring, environmental and social safeguards, and addressing fragility in Africa. Kindly allow me to appreciate the bank's board of directors, management, and staff for ensuring that lessons from evaluations play an important role in shaping the bank's interventions. Ladies and gentlemen, building a stronger and more resilient Africa calls for constant and robust transparency and accountability for using our time and resources. It is evaluators' fundamental role to provide credible and timely evidence on what is working and what is not, to allow the bank, as well as its regional member countries and partners, to improve interventions and strive for a continent that is prosperous, environmentally sustainable, inclusive to all its people, and able to effectively deal with economic, social, and climate-related shocks. Therefore, in tandem with our 2022-2024 work program, IDEV is not only conducting more evaluations of the bank's interventions, but also strongly focusing on the utility and the use of these evaluations, on knowledge sharing and collaboration with stakeholders, and developing national evaluation capacities across the African continent. As African countries emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic into a new reality that few would have predicted only a year earlier, the toll on human lives and health has been lower than in other parts of the world. This is not in small part due to bold actions by African countries. However, their efforts came at a cost, and the economic toll has been more significant. Countries today face economic challenges of public debt and resource mobilization, infrastructure needs for energy, transport, health, water, and sanitation, social challenges such as youth unemployment, fragility, food insecurity, the consequences of climate change, and insufficient resilience to regional or global shocks. We will hear more about these challenges in the first presentation. Africa is thus at an important moment, at a time when the African Development Bank is developing its new 10-year strategy for 2023 to 2032. It is considering pillars such as enhancing agricultural technologies and value chains, renewable energy, productive industries and private sector investment, and regional connectivity to catalyze the crucial task of building a more resilient Africa. IDEV is ready to provide the necessary evaluative knowledge to help ensure that the African people will benefit from these investments. This evaluation week provides a unique forum through which we can harness our intellectual capital and collective knowledge and inspire honest conversations that examine where we are, where we should be, and where we want to be as a continent. The tools we need to get there are also crucial, and we should be able to identify them from such discussions. We have invited a variety of speakers to help us examine different development issues in 6 virtual sessions over 3 days. The sessions will focus on the key challenges facing Africa and the role of evaluation in tackling them. These include providing better access to higher quality and quantity of energy, maximizing the impact of agriculture investments on food security and people's lives, managing debt burdens and building economic resilience of African countries, and ensuring that Africa's growth is inclusive, empowering women and creating jobs and a promising future for its youth. In addition, to ensure the continued growth of a culture of evaluation in Africa, we held a professional development workshop aimed at young and emerging evaluators this morning. We also count on the active participation and contributions from audience members. You all have your own knowledge, expertise, views, and experience, and we encourage you to share these. I believe that the discussions in this virtual space can yield transformational ideas for the African continent that the AfDB and its partners can make good use of in the next 10 years. Thank you once again for joining us, and I wish you fruitful deliberations.
Thank you so much, Karen. 20,380 evaluations in 42 years. That's quite impressive for the organization, and we are all proud to have contributed to shaping the action of the bank so far. I would like now to invite Mr. Simon Mizrahi, Acting Vice President for Technology and Corporate Services, to deliver his opening address on behalf of Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank.
Board members, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for this year's Development Evaluation Week, organized by the African Development Bank Group. It's always a pleasure to be with you for this important event and take part in these meaningful conversations. These are conversations that matter to the bank. They are conversations that guide our operations, policies, and strategic approaches, and help us achieve a shared vision for a prosperous, inclusive, and resilient Africa. Let me use this opportunity to congratulate once again Karen Roth-Münstermann on her appointment as Evaluator General. I know that under Karen's extraordinary leadership, our independent development evaluation function will continue to thrive. It will continue to strengthen the bank's accountability for results, and it will continue to promote learning and use evidence to inform the bank's intervention and ultimately, of course, to improve its development performance. I would also like to thank IDEV for the choice of this year's theme, Building a Stronger and More Resilient Africa. I can't, in fact, think of a better theme to describe what the African Development Bank is doing. It aligns perfectly with the bank's new 10-year strategy that we're currently developing. Ladies and gentlemen, the last time we gathered for Evaluation Week, and that was in 2020, in 2020, the world was plagued by the COVID-19 pandemic. Since then, the bank has invested heavily to support African countries in dealing with and overcoming the effects of the pandemic. But just as we hoped that Africa was emerging from that crisis, events in Ukraine have conspired to create fresh new challenges for Africa's economies and for Africa's people. Amid these challenges, I call on you all to reimagine a picture of a resilient Africa and to reflect on how we can weather and temper the natural and man-made shocks so that their impact on our people and our economies are less devastating. The discussions that we're going to have during this three-day event will focus on areas of strategic importance to the African Development Bank. These areas, if adequately addressed, will allow the bank to contribute to meeting the objectives of the Africa Union's Agenda 2063. This requires us to build an integrated, prosperous and peaceful Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. Some of the questions we will need to examine are the infrastructure gaps in Africa, particularly in the field of energy. We will also need to ask ourselves how we can maximize agricultural productivity and improve food security and nutrition. We will also talk about the increasing debt burden, which is deepening inequalities and is having a detrimental impact on social and human development, and in particular on jobs and youth. Much of the knowledge, the experiences, and the ideas we will be discussing this week are drawn from the African Development Bank's knowledge base. This tells me that the bank's staff have the capacity and are indeed empowered to generate the knowledge that guides our strategic priorities. Ladies and gentlemen, the decision to review and adjust our 10-year strategy to address issues of infrastructure and economic and social progress is informed by the lessons and knowledge that we have gained from our past experience. Experience of what has worked, what has not worked, and why it hasn't worked. Now, while independent evaluations play a crucial part in producing and disseminating this knowledge, all of us, colleagues and peers and partner institutions, board members, we all have an important knowledge and experience to contribute and to share. So I very much encourage you to speak up and share your perspectives, your opinions, your thoughts on how we can go about improving the work of the bank. This is why we value engagements like these, where we can all take a critical look at our approach and our position. I want to leave you now with 3 things to think about as you discuss the challenges facing the African continent and what we can do to strengthen and increase Africa's resilience. First, I think we need to learn not only from our successes, but also our failures. We have 3 days to reflect on these. The only way to learn from past experience is through objective analysis and to question our assumptions and to question our understanding. We need to better understand and disseminate the good practices that have helped us deliver high development returns on our investments. The second point, which I think is a very important point, is creating a safe space where we feel comfortable admitting failure. And this evaluation week, I think, provides us with a safe space where we can have these conversations. So please, I encourage you very much to feel free to talk openly about failures or where results have indeed fallen short of our expectations and draw the lessons from those experiences. We learn from our mistakes. That's how we improve ourselves. That's how we make ourselves accountable. And third, we each need to do our part and speak up. Evaluation Week is unique in that we can reflect, speak out, express our ideas, and share our knowledge every 2 years. This is not only your opportunity, but also, I think, your duty to do so. So please, I very much encourage you to think outside the box. I encourage you to be innovative. There are no wrong answers. This event needs to inform our thinking on how we can make a lasting change to people's lives in Africa. We all aspire to see a united and resilient Africa working together, lifting one another and boosting growth. I sincerely hope and believe that these deliberations will help inform the next 10-year strategy for the bank. It will be a strategy that supports the institution in contributing to the Africa we all want. I wish you all fruitful deliberations over the next 3 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Mr. Mizrahi, Acting Vice President for Technology and Corporate Services. And we also are grateful for the President. And I would like to remind all of us of these 3 points that are very important. Learn from our successes and failures, creating the safe space for admitting failures during this evaluation week, and also speak up and contribute while thinking outside the box. So thank you very much for this opening address. We are now moving to the main course of our event. The panel discussion that is going to take place in a moment will focus on the key challenges facing African people and the continent, and the role of evaluation in tackling them. The topic is going to be introduced by my esteemed colleague, Walter Odhiambo. From the great nation of Kenya, Walter holds a doctorate in economics from the University of Hohenheim in Germany, and a master in economics from the University of Nairobi, Kenya. After a successful career in research, he joined the bank in 2005, and successfully worked in the agriculture and agro-industry department before joining the strategy department as a chief development policy economist. He is currently a lead policy advisor in the strategy and operational policies department of the bank. Walter, thank you for your speech that you can start now.
Let me take this opportunity to thank the Evaluator General for providing this platform to discuss the role of evaluation evidence in policy formulation. Now, this is coming at a very opportune time when the bank is developing a new strategy with the old one coming to an end at the end of the year. And so we have in our hands a practical example of how evaluation can be used in policy design. My brief presentation will therefore cover the following areas. One, I'll provide some context. I'll then look at some major development challenges and opportunities that the continent faces. I'll also make a few words, statements on how we can take advantage of those opportunities and also address some of those challenges. And finally, I will look at how the strategy has taken on board evaluation evidence. Development discourse in Africa has been dominated by 3 major crises. And this is the COVID-19 crisis, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and the climate change conflict, which have already been mentioned by the previous speakers. And you agree with me that these African countries now face not only just a health challenge, but they also face an economic challenge. And at the same time, they face a climate change challenge. So it's a really difficult time. And this is on top of the many other challenges that these countries have been facing because of this crisis. A lot of these countries took a beating in the sense that growth really declined, especially in 2020. There was a slight increase, slight improvement in 2021, but thereafter there has been a decline again. And this is not just in Africa, but in other countries as well. And so it has been a difficult time. Now, we don't know how this is going to shape, to look like in the years to come, but there are those who are already predicting that a recession, some kind of a global recession is imminent going forward. So if this really comes this happens, then you will, will agree with me that it's going to be more difficult for these African countries to really cope. Now, because of the Ukraine crisis, or the Ukraine conflict, prices in most of these countries has gone. They've come under increasing inflationary pressure. And so inflation has been rising very, very fast in these countries, with in certain countries reaching up to 500%, the 300 in places like Zimbabwe and Sudan. So it's really a difficult challenge for these countries. Now, because of the inflationary pressure and then because of the COVID crisis, gross financing for these countries has become a big challenge, has increased. And as a result, debt burdens have gone up. So these countries, because of the need to finance themselves out of this crisis, they've been resorting to a lot of borrowing. But I think it's important to mention here that this didn't just start with the COVID crisis. Debts were already rising even before COVID. And so I think the crisis has just made the situation a little worse. And so as we speak, around 23 countries are either facing debt distress or are in moderate levels of debt distress. So it's really a problem for these countries. Now, overall, in our own assessment, we find that many of these countries are now very, very vulnerable. In one of the analyses that we have done, we found that the economic vulnerability of these countries has increased because of the crisis and the other things that we've just mentioned, but also the physical vulnerability of these countries have increased, so that in 2022, the indices is up to 53, 60% of that. So physical vulnerability is largely because of climate change and other physical constraints that these countries face. But in addition to those vulnerabilities, of course, we still have huge investment gaps in critical sectors. And you heard from the statement of the president, identify a number of sectors which are really, where investment is really required. In agriculture, for example, there's really need to provide infrastructure to increase agricultural productivity because the productivity in those sectors are low. In energy, there's a lot of there's need for providing reliable and also in the social sectors to do with issues of jobs and youth and so on. So the investment gaps for infrastructure in critical sectors remain a challenge in many of these countries. Climate change continues to be a big problem in many of these countries, and it represents by far the single biggest threat to development right now. It's estimated that countries are losing up to 4% of GDP. They will be losing 4% of GDP by 2040 because of climate change. That countries are spending upwards of 7 to 15 billion each year just to address issues of climate change. So it remains a major challenge for African countries to cope with. Now, although governance profiles of most African countries have improved, it remains a big problem still. Corruption continues to be a problem in certain countries, and this is already affecting investment and suppressing public trust, or rather suppressing, eroding public trust in governments in these countries. This is despite the fact that there had been already some improvements in the government profiles of most African countries. Now, the other challenge, of course, that we had picked up as part of the analysis of our of the TYS is, of course, political and violent conflicts which arise in the continent. There's a big problem with political-related conflicts, which is, of course, disrupting economic activities in most countries. Now, but the story is not all bleak. I think there are opportunities that can be taken advantage of, and some of the opportunities that we have identified include the AfCFTA, which is a trade agreement which has been signed in the continent, and we think this can provide a means by which these countries can really improve on the economic performance. We all know the benefits of AfCFTA if implemented. It will ease and simplify trade. It's likely to diversify trade from commodity dependence, in the sense that people will now, countries will now try to produce different commodities rather than the single commodities. It's likely to drive industrialization, and more importantly, to facilitate transition to digital economy. So this is one area where there's some hope if, in fact, this is taken advantage of. Besides that, there are other opportunities for leapfrogging. These include, of course, urbanization in Africa, which is increasing very rapidly. A huge population, and especially youth population, that is a common feature in most countries. The continent's natural resources, and the trends in digitalization. These are some of the areas where opportunities exist, and countries could actually take advantage of as they develop. Given the kind of challenges that these countries have been facing after the crisis, I think one of the most important things would be to devise ways in which an economic recovery can take place. And so, as part of the 10 years proposal, we are proposing a rapid, inclusive, resilient, and green growth as one of the key areas that we really need to focus on, so that the countries can come back to the levels they were before the crisis. Now, on top of that, I've already talked about the AfCFTA as one of the areas that is important. But also there are areas of health infrastructure, which we also need to invest in, issues to do with agriculture, and more importantly, debt sustainability and climate change. These are areas that are very, very important, and we think needs to be considered going forward. And so we have looked at some of the possibilities in the new strategy. Now, to reduce the vulnerability, of course, there is need to look at how countries can become more diversified, economic diversification, by unleashing the private sector. And this will, of course, help in creating sustainable jobs and livelihoods for a majority of the population in the continent. And lastly, of course, the need to meet the SDGs, which are soon coming to a close, but are very, very important going forward. Now, let me now move on to the last part of the presentation, and this has to do with what role evaluation evidence has had in the implementation, in the design of the new strategy that we're working on. Now, what I have on the screen is actually what I call a value chain for policy formulation. It all starts with the agenda setting, and then you move on to policy formulation, and then implementation, and then back again to policy. So what happens is that in the policy formulation stage, this is where evidence becomes very, very important. And that's where evaluation evidence that is generated within and outside the institution becomes very, very important in designing policy. And once it is designed, then the policy is implemented. But even as we implement policy, there's always constant evaluation of the activities, so that the lessons learned in the implementation are also feedback to the policy formulation. So that is a chain of That's how we conceptualize it, and I think that's what has happened so far. So just to be a little more specific, we have used evidence, evaluation evidence in the design of a new strategy or in the work going on in the new strategy in two ways. One is the accountability part. One will always ask us, if you're doing a new strategy, what did you achieve with the previous strategy? And so that question needs to be answered. And that's where now the self-assessment has become very important. So we have been able to get evidence of what we achieved in the previous strategy from our colleagues in the evaluation departments. But more importantly, learning. Important lessons have been learned from the evaluation reports. We've learned lessons that will be incorporated in the design of the new strategy. These include, of course, certain things which did not work well. Like it was said, I think we need to be very candid of what worked and what did not work. So important lessons were learned there. I'll give, for example, the issue of the theory of change. The previous strategy, as many may know, did not have an elaborate theory of change. And so this is one of the areas which was quickly picked up by the evaluation and was pointed to us and told that, okay, in next strategy should actually look at that. And that's where the work actually began, looking at the theory of change. There are also some challenges to do with the alignment of the result framework with the strategy itself. So very important lessons have also been drawn from the preliminary evaluation reports that you have received. And of course, will be taken on board as we implement as we design the new strategy. And of course, there are certain things that did not work. So we've also learned lessons of what are the enabling factors and what are the hindering factors for strategy implementation in the bank. And that will also be incorporated. So there's a very rich this information, very rich information that has come from the evaluation of the previous strategy, and not just the previous strategy. There are other strategies in the bank, the high fives and the other strategies that the bank has been implementing, which will go into the design of the new strategy.
So moving forward to steer the discussion, we will now turn to our moderator, Mr. Niels Breyer. ED Breyer is since 2020 the executive director for Germany, Luxembourg, Portugal, and Switzerland in the African Development Bank. He has a very strong knowledge of development issues of Africa, for having collaborated throughout his career with the African Development Bank as well as other multilateral development banks. His solid ground experience was also gained working in countries such as Somalia, Mozambique, and recently in Nigeria, where he led the German support program for the ECOWAS Commission. A great part of his career, he worked in the Ministry of Economic Cooperation of the federal government of Germany as head of division for West and Central Africa, but also coordinator to the G8 Africa personal representative to the federal chancellor. He was also the deputy director that negotiated the 2030 agenda for sustainable development on behalf of the German federal government. ED Breyer has a background in banking with a master in economics, but also a postgraduate in development policy and economics. I think he's therefore very well placed by his experience and position to help us navigate through the current subject and with the support of our panelists. ED Breyer, you have the floor.
Let me maybe start by first introducing the panel and then afterwards giving them some guidance. And I would like to start with our honorable Member of Parliament from the Republic of Benin, Honorable Jeremy Adomaho. He is a member of the National Assembly of Benin. He is the chairperson of the African Parliamentarians Network on Development Evaluation. He is a rural equipment engineer by training and an expert in water and sanitation. And as a member of parliament, he held many positions. Notably, he was member of the Planning, Equipment and Production Commission. He was a coordinator of the network of the Beninois parliamentarians for climate, environment and sustainable development. He was the rapporteur for the network of Beninois parliamentarians for water and sanitation. He served previously as a vice president of the network of Beninois members of parliament for water and sanitation, and also as a coordinator of the AfDB national chapter in Benin, as a member of that executive committee from 2017 to 2019. So I think we would be glad if we had more members of parliament everywhere in the world with such a strong development background. And I would like to give you a very warm welcome, and we are happy that you are with us, Honorable Deputy. We have also on the panel Mrs. Fatima Zuma. She is the Executive Director of the Center for International Development at the Harvard University. I think one of the most renowned development institutes in the world. Suma has a distinguished career in the US government, including appointments as the Vice President of Compact Operations at the US Millennium Challenge Corporation. She was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Southern and Central Asia at the US Department of State, and a senior professional staff member on the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee. She also worked in civil society at Oxfam America and the American Civil Liberties Union. And in 2021, she published her debut book, The Development Diplomat, working across borders, boardrooms, and bureaucracies to end poverty. Suma graduated with an MPA from Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs and a BA in government from Cornell University. She received an honorary doctorate from the Middlesbrough Institute of International Studies at Monterey. A warm welcome to you, Suma, as well, and thank you very much that you found the time to enrich our discussion. We have also with us Mr. Nahura Yeo, who holds from Côte d'Ivoire. He holds a PhD from the collaborative PhD program of the African Economic Research Consortium in partnership with African universities, including the University of Abidjan. He holds an environmental economics certificate from the School of Economics and Commercial Law of Göteborg University in Sweden. Since 2008, he teaches economics and holds positions of responsibility in public and private universities in Côte d'Ivoire. And in September 2013, he joined the Economic Policy Analysis Unit of CIRIS as an expert in public finance. For more than 3 years, he contributed to the influence of the unit and its strategic positioning at the national and international levels through research and capacity building activities. And since February 2017, he has held the position of Director of Cabinet of the Minister of Planning and Development in Côte d'Ivoire. In this capacity, he coordinates the activities of the ministerial department and oversees the implementation of numerous projects. In 2020, he received the distinction of Commander in the Order of Merit of the Public Service of the Republic of the Côte d'Ivoire. Monsieur Yeo, also a warm welcome to you, and we are happy that a representative of our host country is also enriching our discussion. And last but not least, we have Walter Odiambo, and I think, as he was already introduced, by Oswald. I think, with your permission, Walter, I just say that you are a long-serving member of the African Development Bank, but you had a strong background research and scientific career in Kenya, but also I'm happy to learn that you have a PhD from the University Hohenheim of my country of birth, Germany. So, panelists, I think we will have a very interesting discussion, and as we learned from the presentation and also from the introductory remarks by President Adesina, that Africa is confronted with a lot of crises, multiple crises, COVID, climate change, and now also the Russian war in the Ukraine, which reduces growth and increases inflation. The economic vulnerability is higher than in other developing countries. We have a huge investment gap, mainly in infrastructure, in agriculture, and I would say the entire productive sector, also to increase value addition in Africa. We need investments in the social sector, in particular health and education. I would add, from my perspective, also access to finance in order to, in particular, give more economic opportunities to women and the young generation, which is much better educated than it was in the past. We have additional challenges around governance still, conflicts in a number of regions in Africa, and the continent is again faced with a rising debt issue or debt problem. We also have opportunities. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA. As I said, a well-educated younger generation, growing markets due to a growing population, and Africa is still endowed with many natural resources, and digital industry, digital service sector has shown strong growth in the last years. My first question to our panelists would be, what can evaluation contribute so that these challenges are met? And in particular, I would like to ask you, I mean, as we are now looking back to some decades of evaluation, where maybe evaluation needs to become more effective, maybe more influential, what kind of maybe governance changes in development organizations do we need so that these findings of evaluation are better entering into national strategies and practical politics. And I would like to invite the Honorable Jeremy Adumahu maybe to take the floor first. Over to you.
That I salute all the participants in this opening session. And I would like to thank the AfDB for having invited me in this discussion. And I also would like to thank the bank for having hosted the Secretariat of AppNode over the last 8 years. Africa has gone through a lot, health crises, various infrastructural difficulties, but Africa has proven to be resilient for the various reasons that colleagues have already outlined, the evaluation that have been carried out to help us strengthen Africa. We have been working on defining the various budgets and actions to help in the African in the actions of Africa, but we are still lagging behind in terms of decision making, and this is what the bank must press on with all of our leaders, so that public policy becomes a priority in decision making. And I think that this political will needs to have a legal grounding. And the parliamentarians that we are have to play this kind of role. And that's what we're trying to do, because in the definition of policies, the legislators that we are have to work on the various laws that need to be implemented and that can make public policy a healthy area. And in voting budgets, we need to have the tools to be able to understand the budgets. And to do this, we are legislators, we are not specialists in evaluation, and we need for evaluation to be institutionalized. And we believe that's the ideal formula for improving our various institutions. If a country misses the chance of bringing this into the constitution, we need to find other ways of working through the parliament and senate for a commission to help with specialists in evaluation. And we need, in addition to this, to have a law on evaluation so that all the sectors of government
I do believe that that will boost the development of Africa, and that will help us to be more resilient in coping with the various crises that we have to cope with. And if I have to give some details regarding the food crisis due to the war in Ukraine, we've been dependent on the outside world with respect to the bulk of our food, whereas we have fertile soil. There's a need to finance research and to come up with resilient crops so that we can better cope with climate change and environmental degradation, so that Africa will have food self-sufficiency and not be heavily dependent on the outside world in case of crisis. Moreover, we must invest much within our countries in the area of health infrastructure, because when there is a problem and we lack the requisite infrastructure to cope with the diseases and health burden, we are challenged. The same applies to our villages where climate change and our cities where problems related to flooding affect the population adversely. So I think that there is much work to be done in our countries to ensure that the work of evaluation is considered as a priority by, first and foremost, institutionalizing it, providing it with a stable framework so that it is not called into question subsequently. That is what I can put on the table from the outset, and perhaps I will come back if given the chance to take the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator.
Fatima Zuma, maybe you can give us some insights from your scientific work. Why has obviously evaluation such difficulties to bring its results and findings to more attention so that we in the end all of us are able to implement a more sustainable and more long-lasting policies and intervention? Where do you see the challenges?
First, I think what we have seen at CID is that having a theory of change, having a planned approach to confront a policy challenge, it's not enough, right? We can have ideas and theories about why we have current policy failures, but oftentimes our theories are ambiguous in its actual predictions, or we don't get the theory right the first time around. So the first shift that I think we need to start seeing, and that we're really pushing from CID, is valuing the knowledge base that we can get from evidence and approaching the theory to help us frame the problem and consider the trade-offs. Evidence in particular, whether that's new evaluations, research data, or administrative data, this is so important in how information can then actually be used for policymakers in making the decisions. You know, if you leave the development sector for a moment and you think about other sectors, like you think of the work of an engineer, for instance, engineers draw up blueprints for machines based on the theory of mechanics, and then they build samples. But then they test those samples systematically over and over for their effectiveness. Sometimes the experiment can overheat or explode, and then they go back to the drawing board and try again. And it's an iterative process of learning. And I think it's that culture of first valuing knowledge and valuing evidence and bringing that to the forefront that would be a big shift in how we can use evidence in much more effective ways. At CID, we work with over 120 plus faculty who are working with cutting edge research with exactly this in mind. And we believe evaluation and their application and policy decision-making can be the crux of AfDB's new strategy. And congratulations, Niels, and to the entire team for the work you're doing on that strategy. Let me give you a quick snapshot of what some of this can look like. So we have work on health. We talked about healthcare infrastructure and how that's one of the major challenges facing Africa. We have professors like Professor Yusuf Zai and Professor Margaret Crux who are working to look at different kinds of programs like Tanzania family parenting and mother-only parenting programs and whether or not they're actually effective, to the broader health quality systems and looking at improvements of measurement and generalized knowledge. We have other programs like Ghana and Tax to look at whether or not governments actually have the resources available through Professor Anders Jensen work in Ghana on evaluating assessive technologies used for tax. We're looking at work on the education sector in countries like Burkina Faso through Professor Dan Levy's work on interventions around increasing girls' enrollment in schools in Burkina. So my point is that we have a wealth of research and evidence on what works and what doesn't work across AfD member states from our work to date. We have the blueprint, and we're really happy to connect anyone who's interested, any organizations here, AfDB, and other partners in governments to the work that CID research is already doing to connect those dots. But that alone, a blueprint alone, without the rigorous evaluations and without the use, is not going to be a magic bullet. So let me sum up two other pieces that I think are really important, Niels, to your question. In addition to valuing knowledge, which we just talked about, and the wealth of knowledge that we at CID and many other institutions have, The second most important piece, I think, is really building a culture of how we use that knowledge. How do we use that evidence in real time in policy-making positions, right? In positions that the honorable ministers here have and our other colleagues and partners throughout the AfDB member states. And I think building a culture of evidence that is really looking at localized solutions, the sustainability of those solutions, and how you actually value that culture is incredibly important. That brings me to my third point, which is we could really increase the emphasis around how we train policy actors to actually use this evidence in real time. And CID, I think, is at the forefront of doing just this with our very interesting and results-based capacity building programs that we have throughout different levels. We look to train policy actors to actually how they can use this evidence in their decision making through programs like our Be Cure program, which is building capacity to use research evidence, our Building State Capability program, where we help public organizations implement policies and programs through iterative adaptation. So I think, Niels, to sum this up to say, if we can really create a culture in this new 10-year strategy that places a premium of valuing the knowledge and the wealth of the research and evidence to date, transitions that to building a culture of how that evidence is used, and then training policy actors through programs such as the one CID has, but I know many others as well, of how to use that evidence. I think then you get to the tipping point that really starts to accelerate the type of changes that we know have to happen to address the problems that were so elegantly laid out at the top of the session. So thank you.
I think I can more or less directly hand over to Yeo Nahua. I mean, you are an academic, but you are also an important part, I would say, from Ivorian politics and how to manage, in particular, development and economic policy. So maybe you can give us some insight from your personal experience, how the Ivorian government is dealing, how are you valuing knowledge and evidence? How are you building a culture to use this knowledge and to use evidence also in time? I would be interested to learn a little bit from your inside view. Over to you. Thank you.
The theme we are discussing is actually very important, and I would not like to revisit what has been said regarding the role, the issues, and the practice of evaluation in development. But I wish to flag a couple of issues, particularly how to steer change in our policies in Africa. First and foremost, promoting the cultural evaluation can help us to address the challenges besetting us. And let me also flag some of the difficulties that we are facing in our administrations. Let me start by talking about how to implement policy and political change. For instance, when you have budget credits, you are using the resources of the taxpayers and you have to implement your policies. How do you go about understanding the positive changes that you must carry out? Another difficulty has to do with the lack of evidence to enlighten decision-making, because when you have to implement a policy, even if you know and you want this policy to be effectively carried out, you need tools, and that is one thing, especially if evaluation has several gaps. And moreover, there are obstacles regarding the use of results, and even when the results may exist, there's a need to have political willingness to use these evidence. And so at times you have changes in those who are the users of these policies and changes in those who have to implement the policies, and this calls for boldness in carrying out these policies. Last but not least, resources, human resources to implement the policies, but also ensure that there is an evaluation of the policies rolled out, because evaluation entails costs, and oftentimes we do not have the requisite resources to carry through the project, but also to finance this evaluation. And many studies have shown that most of the evaluations are done by international bodies. At the current stage of Africa's development, we can note that there is a pressing call for results, telling results on the ground. And looking at all the crises besetting Africa, development partners must provide answers. And this is done through programs and implementing result-based projects. So the practice and the culture of evaluation is the lever that will bring about a high performance in our countries and ensure that there is sustainability in performance regarding transparency and accountability. So today, these evaluation leverage is very important to have successful development planning and development policies that are more efficient. Looking at the experience of Cote d'Ivoire in addressing some of these challenges, let's start by pointing out the evaluation framework. We're talking about a culture of evaluation, but all the stakeholders on the ground, and bear this in mind when we're talking about evaluation, you have internal evaluation conducted by the executive, and you have external evaluation. And here you have bodies such as parliament, the audit bodies, and other external evaluation structures that will interact to set up this framework and ensure that you have systematic conduct of evaluation of policies being implemented. And to establish such a framework, the previous speakers have said this. In Benin, a member of parliament did say this. There is a framework that has to be put in place for all the actors to express themselves, because there are bodies that are involved. There are those who have to bring the funding, those who have to carry out the policies, and the experts who have to conduct the evaluation, because it's not an easy task. In Cote d'Ivoire, we've understood that there's a need to have this framework to ensure that all the actors can express themselves regarding both internal and external evaluation. And we've noted that by ensuring development planning and making it central to government action, it will facilitate evaluation. Because when you have to carry out successive development plans and you make sure that they are based on resource-based management, this impacts on the manner in which policy is designed, because there are elements of evaluation that are factored in. Moreover, by having all the macroeconomic and microeconomic elements in the framework, people pay particular attention with regards to the outcome of these policies, and that is why we had to come up with a law on evaluation. We are also preparing a bill or a regulation on the guide to evaluation, the national evaluation policy, which will ensure that all the stakeholders can work towards that goal. So as part of the institutionalizing evaluation, Cote d'Ivoire is making giant strides forward. We have drawn some lessons, namely that all the stakeholders should be part and parcel of this exercise. And as I said earlier on, how do we go about evaluating a policy, ensuring that there is buy-in with regard to the results, and the results are the reference for building a policies? This calls for inclusiveness. All the stakeholders have to be involved by ensuring that everybody is part and parcel of the policy making and the setting up of the institutional framework. So I will stop at this juncture and say that the we have a problem with having a framework that gets experts to do this work will provide adequate results. Thank you. I'll wait for the questions. Mr. Moderator, over.
Now I would like to give the floor to Walter. I mean, we listened to Monsieur Nahua. He raised a number of relevant issues and also challenges. My question is, how can the African Development Bank support regional member countries? And what can maybe the bank better offer than other partners? Over to you.
Like I indicated in my presentation, from the perspective of an institution like the African Development Bank, the whole purpose of evaluation is to understand the outcomes of our interventions and also to learn lessons for the future. Like it was indicated in the president's statement, we need really to learn from our successes and from our failures. So that's very important. Now, luckily for the institution like the bank, there's a tradition of using this kind of evidence in some of the work that we do. So we have a strong evaluation function in the bank, and that helps quite a bit in coming up with the interventions that we undertake in different countries. But that might not be the case in other, let's say, in our countries, in our regional member countries, where that capacity to be able to generate evidence, the capacity to be able to use that evidence in this kind of things might not be there. And so I think then the bank has a role to really assist some of these countries to be able to strengthen their capacity to use evidence in policy formulation. Like you indicated in the introduction, I used to work for a policy think tank back in Kenya, and the purpose of this policy think tank was really to generate evidence, which then could be used for policy analysis, and that kind of support in strengthening this kind of institutions so that they are able to generate evidence from different sectors of the economy, from different activities that the government undertake, I think will be very, very important in my view, as relates directly to the issue of using knowledge, using evidence in policy formulation and all that. So increased support to some of these think tanks, increased support to networks like the African Economic Research Consortium and all that will be, in my view, very, very useful in furthering use of knowledge and use of evidence in policy analysis and formulation. I'm not sure you wanted me to comment on what the bank needs to concretely do in other areas of development. Like I said, I think the continent already faces quite a number of challenges, and there's a lot that can be done. There are challenges to do with infrastructure, which the bank has been doing over the years, and I think the bank needs to do that a little more. But I think right now the elephant in the room, in my own view, is the issue to do with climate change, which the bank really needs to help African countries to do that. And the focus, in my view, should be on issues of adaptation. So we really need to go big in adaptation investments so that we are able to support countries to overcome the challenges that they are facing in the area of climate change. And already the bank has a number of programs. I have in mind, for example, the African Accelerated Program for Climate Adaptation, which can actually assist countries to deal with the challenge of climate change. Now, other areas, of course, like debt is important, is a big thing. And I think the bank is already doing a lot and needs to do much more to be able to support capacity for debt management in some of these countries in terms of being able to manage their debt more prudently. Besides, of course, being a source of concessional debts, I think the bank can do much more than that. So there, let me stop there and see if you have any further questions. But there are quite a number of other areas that the bank could intervene in. Thank you.
I would like to start with Suma. Do you have any, I mean, we listened to the challenges right now and what needs to be done. Do you have any evidence from your scientific work, any comparative evidence if other continents are using evaluation evidence in a different way, maybe in a more productive way, or is Africa, where I believe we have a strong culture of evaluation, is Africa maybe ahead of others because traditionally we are living in quite open societies, and as Naua pointed out, involvement of all stakeholders is always very key. So if you have any such evidence, maybe you can share with us, and then we can maybe draw some further lessons for our discussion. Thank you.
You know, I think the way I would answer this question is that both in Africa and certainly in other parts, whether Latin America, Asia, and you know, globally, there is a wealth of knowledge that is being generated and has been generated, as you said, and I think earlier in the session, that has been generated for decades. And so the knowledge does exist, and new knowledge and cutting edge knowledge. I cited some of it earlier from some of our Harvard faculty, certainly has the capacity to help really give us the blueprint and the frameworks to think differently around choices we make in program design and implementation and the policy choices we make. I think where, you know, Niels, it'd be interesting to think about is how the culture of knowledge can be used by AfDB member states in Africa, and how maybe that has been used in other places, right? And it's hard to aggregate across continents. I'm a little bit loath to do that because it's hard to just make these blanket comparisons continent to continent. But certainly if you look at other countries and you look, Professor Asim Koja, for instance, who's the faculty director at Center for International Development, he has been leading a body of research that's very cutting edge on the education sector in places like Pakistan. And his ability to tie the research side to how that is actually being used by education policymakers throughout the government, with also multilateral institutions, aid agencies, and others to inoculate a culture of use are, I think, the kinds of examples that we want to consider in applying localized solutions to the challenges facing AfDB member states. I want to emphasize that, you know, there is no silver bullet, and there is not one solution we know that's going to solve a problem. Niger is going to be very, very different than the problems in Ghana or the problems in Kenya in what they are facing. Certainly even Benin and Cote d'Ivoire, while you have many common challenges, there's going to be a lot of differences in application. So I think it's around how do you strengthen the muscle of the political usage of evidence in decision-making is something to think about. And I think you've seen successes and failures across the world in this. So it's hard for me to generalize right now. And I would hate to do that without using evidence to make that kind of declarative statement. But I know we've certainly seen places that have been able to jumpstart their economies, help really push middle-class growth and much more inclusive and sustainable growth, are sectors across the board, both government, but also private sector actors who are very, very important in the infrastructure and the social service delivery that needs to come, that are able to incorporate that both from within their countries, but also using comparative data in relative sectors from other countries and other continents as well.
Maybe we go back to the parliamentarian part of our parliamentarian wing of our panel. Honorable Jeremy. I mean, we just heard, I think, something. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I think we heard something which you also already mentioned, and this is around political will. I mean, Benin is for many years a democracy, and I think a very inclusive society. As a parliamentarian, where do you see room for improvement, or where the system of political decision-making could be refined so that evidence is gaining more momentum and is much more a basis of political decision making.
For the case of Benin, my country, I'll briefly explain that the executive is well in advance. The executive has made great strides. We have a national evaluation plan that has been developed and implementation ended in 2021, and now another plan is being developed to cover 2022 to 2031. So the national evaluation plan exists, and we have an evaluation system in place. We are trying to inculcate the practice of evaluation, and we are trying to complete its institutionalization. So the whole government is involved, and the National Assembly has been apprised. We revised the Constitution in 2019, and we have incorporated evaluation. We have opted to have an act to ensure that we have the culture of evaluation inculcated. After the national evaluation plan that expired in 2021, I mentioned that we're in the process of developing another one spanning 2022 to 2031. And we want to institutionalize evaluation so that we professionalize all stakeholders and so that we encourage the use of knowledge as well as strengthen evaluation for more accountability. So this is all in progress, including the Act. So the National Assembly is examining the bill, and once it is promulgated by parliamentarians, we will need support from practitioners, support from evaluators, so that we are able to understand the documentation, budget documents, the laws introduced by the executive in parliament for the implementation of the government action plan. I would just like to say that Benin has made great strides, and now we need to look at institutions, and parliamentarians will be playing a big role when they enact laws. Our mandate ends in February, but during the APNUD session, we ensured that we will vote that law before the end of February 2023. In sum, that is where Benin is regarding evaluation.
I would like to hand over again to Yeo Nahua. And maybe asking him what the Ivorian government in particular does to institutionalize evaluation. And I'm also referring to maybe the first question which is coming in, which is exactly covering this issue. Institutionalization of evaluation is coming up as a key theme, as the input from George Shiduva. How can the institutionalization and professionalization of evaluation be accelerated in Africa? Does institutionalization of evaluation mean the same thing to member countries? How can the use and generation of evidence be promoted in member countries? What role should the bank, AU, and other partners play? Over to you.
I'll try to talk about what Côte d'Ivoire has done specifically to institutionalize evaluation. The evidence-based decision-making is important for institutionalization of evaluation in Côte d'Ivoire. As I mentioned earlier on, regarding institutionalization, there is a framework. The speaker's sound is going on and off, but interpreter will try to render what is being said. So there's a framework, and the framework has been put in place by an act. And before we even developed the act, we tried to build the capacities of all control institutions, internal control, and other institutions. Internal control covers ongoing programs, and that is the first analysis of programs and policy evaluation. We did not have the requisite human and financial resources for evaluation in the past, and we need to look at this, ensure that the structures involved are strengthened. We have the Court of Audit, and we have the parliamentarians, as well as other institutions. Law needs to be enacted, and we need to have a reference framework, and that is the stage where we are at. The law has been adopted by 2 chambers of parliament. We are waiting for promulgation. We are waiting for all internal and external evaluation guides. And we will also have a national evaluation plan that should be adopted, and all concerned structures will be able to act. The Ministry of Planning is responsible for evaluation activities. We also have statistical matters that are covered by that ministry. So we need to have disaggregated data for evaluation purposes. We are trying to reform the statistical sector so that we have regular data being provided, and so that we are able to implement our policy. We conducted a demographic survey, a population census, and all these surveys are being conducted so that we have the requisite data. And in addition to this, we've noted that many structures, be they private or public structures, require capacity building. Recently, there's a foundation that gave training to persons in academia. So if the stakeholders have the necessary tools, and if we have the reference frameworks in place, we'll be able to move faster on. And if we have the necessary data, of course, or evidence, then we will get concrete results in the area of evaluation. As I mentioned earlier on, we need resources, technical and financial resources. Human resources also need to be developed. We need support from our partners. When you design an infrastructure project, for example, generally speaking, if you've got the chance to be funded by a partner, in addition to the infrastructure project, you have the road and all the services that are linked to the construction of the road. For example, electricity. If you have a high tension line, or if you do not have electricity supplied to the households nearby, then that is a challenge. So the infrastructure project would be one thing, but there are subcomponents that you also need to take into account. And you need to mobilize resources for implementation, and you also need to mobilize resources for evaluation. So resources are the sinew of this war, and we need to determine the responsibility of partners in our national evaluation policies. And we also need to concretely ask partners what we want in the area of capacity building. And when we need to conduct studies in the sector, social sectors, support is needed. We need to be able to jointly evaluate the projects as well as look at the design of the said projects. I'd like to stop there, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. There are a number of questions coming in, so I would like to invite all panelists to be as brief and crisp as possible. I think we have now 25 minutes left, so I think the more questions we can discuss, the more lively will be our discussion. And I would like to I have a question for you, Honorable Jeremy, from a former colleague of you, a former parliamentarian of the Republic of Niger, Gadou Bourema. He came up with an interesting question asking if parliamentarians will be equipped to use the evaluation criteria for the implementation of parliamentary functions. Then everybody would be able to change not only the design of public policy, but also during the implementation. Do you share this view? So also to apply evaluation criteria on the parliamentarian work. This is how I understand the question.
I mentioned earlier on in my first intervention that we as parliamentarians are not necessarily experts in the area of evaluation. And to boost development, to ensure that there's quality public service delivered, and given the role played by parliamentarians and specifically the enacting of laws, we need to look at the budget allocated to the implementation of government policies. As politicians, as parliamentarians, we need the support of experts. We need evaluators, experienced evaluators to support parliamentarians. But before that, parliamentarians need their capacities strengthened to adopt a law, to understand a policy. We need to really understand what it involves, even though we are not experts in that field. We need to have the minimum of evaluation skills. We would have ad hoc or standing committees with staff in our senates and national assemblies, and have evaluation experts as part of those staff. So the executive could also do the work on its own, but I believe that institutions that are meant to vote the budget, vote laws, that institution or those institutions, and here I'm referring to the Parliament and the Senate, need to be supported by professionals. Parliamentarians have mandates and terms of office end. When our capacities are built, we want to ensure that we create a core of experts. But at the end of our term of office, we need to ensure that we have parliamentarians that have basic evaluation skills. So we need to be involved in evaluation, but be supported by a technical staff. Technical staff should always advise newly elected members of parliament so that they're able to monitor governance in our respective countries. That requires a budget, it requires funds, and as we vote budgets, we need to ensure that adequate funds are allocated because in the draft bill that we are working on, 1 to 3% of the national budget will go to evaluation, and that will enable us to bring on board experts in evaluation. That is my brief response to the question asked.
The next question goes to Walter. It's from Dan Mianye. And the question is, you mentioned climate change as the single biggest threat to development in Africa. Don't you think corruption should be the single biggest threat instead?
I think both are big problems in Africa, but I think we can do much more. We have much more control on corruption than we have on climate change. We can stop corruption if we have the proper systems in place, and we can actually eliminate it in certain circumstances. But when it comes to climate change, it's a much bigger problem. Sometimes we find that the causes are not even within your realm. It's caused somewhere else, like it's happening in Africa, and we suffer from it. But more importantly, I think the cost for doing something about climate change is increasingly very, very high, especially for African countries. So yes, both are problems, but I think climate change for me is a more intractable problem than the other. But again, it's just a matter of argument. It depends on the context and how you look at it. No yes or no answer here, Chair.
The next question, maybe a short or a short answer. Yeonaua. There's a question from Joshua Duhami. Evaluation is increasingly essential for the performance of public action, but sometimes the results are hardly accepted by public actors. How to improve this?
Thank you for that question. Evidently, evaluation is essential. When we evaluate, we want a change in the implementation, development, and design of policies. If we do not have a consensus of the evaluation results, then that would be a challenge, because we'll have spent a lot of time evaluating a policy and the results would have been rejected. It is imperative that stakeholders agree on the results that will come out of the evaluation, and we need to develop a consensus on how the evaluation would be conducted. Does the evaluation comply with principles? Is the evaluator independent, autonomous? Does the evaluator have the requisite skills? So if we are in agreement on the principles, and we agree that the person conducting the evaluation is the right choice, then results should be accepted. And that is why it is important to have a reference framework for evaluation.
We come to a very pertinent issue in Africa, which was raised in Walter's presentation. And this is fragility and conflict. And I think fragility and conflict are maybe limiting how evaluation results could be used, and maybe in situations where they are even more necessary and more required, because we often talk about countries with not so strong institutions. We talk about governments who just came in office and are maybe confronted with a certain lack of experience. So Fatima Zuma, maybe you could, before we have a round with the panelists, maybe you can share with us some evidence. What are specific requirements, specific challenges when it comes to the question how to use evaluation results for policy making? Wow, in this specific context, how can we ensure that policy decision makers have access? Maybe we have some tool and instruments from your experience how to deal with this issue. Thank you.
So Niels, thank you for that. Let me try to marry your question also with some of the earlier questions and responses from the honorable ministers in Benin and Cote d'Ivoire as well. So, given the backdrop and the context of the intersectionality of challenges, I think that African countries are facing, and certainly as the AfDB thinks about its 10-year strategy. Let me offer a couple of thoughts here. So first is, let me again emphasize that we do have a wealth of knowledge on what works and what does not work around the world and in Africa. And I'm very happy, I put it in the chat, please do reach out to us at cid@harvard.edu, and we can connect you to our amazing research and faculty who are doing this work. If we have it, we want to be able to share it with you, and that is a service we can provide. So please do reach out to us as a partner in your efforts as you think some of that through. When you think about how to use knowledge, and I think that's really what we're circling around here, right? Is how do we actually effectively then use the knowledge that we have generated and created? Let me offer a couple of tangible things that we could think about. And maybe Walter, as you're thinking through also on the AfDB side as well. So the first is, one of the things we could consider in Africa that we have done in Latin America and in other places across academia is think about creating a research consortia that could actually be with researchers and policy actors to both identify this evidence base and the knowledge that we have, and increase awareness that it's out there and it's easier to access, so that if you're on the policymaking side, it's more of a one-stop shop of what could be applicable to you, and you don't have to sort through so much, which I think can be very overwhelming. This consortia could have direct links to policymakers on the front lines of AfDB member states. And we do have experience where you've seen this take place in other contexts. Latin America and other places come to mind here. The second is when you think about an evidence of how you can use, a culture of how to use evidence, let's think about training in a couple of concrete ways. So, and this is a couple of questions that came up in the chat. I've responded in writing as well. So when we think about training, it is important to train parliamentarians, political figures, and those at the top for all the obvious reasons. They do run governments. They do run and are ultimately accountable for their institutions. But it's also important to think about those at multiple levels, civil servants in the bureaucracies that will not change when the political coalitions change, for instance. Actors in local levels, not just in capital cities, but also thinking through local institutions and capacity building of local institutions that are not just government institutions, right? And this is where civil society partners and consortium with private sector actors can be very, very powerful. So we offer training, and we can customize this training from CID, whether that's through executive education, whether that's through customized trainings that some of our programs like the CID Growth Lab, Building State Capacity, and others offer. That can be customized, that we can customize whether you're on the parliamentarian track, civil servants, local institutions, to really think through a culture of how to use evidence if you are not an evaluator. And I think that's really important. And for those of us who are not on the evaluation side, but those of us responsible for making decisions on how we should spend budgets, what we should prioritize, what we should go in a strategy, it's important that we also have those skills. And training a new generation to use evaluation can be one of the most powerful investments that we make in this next 10-year strategy. The last thing I wanted to offer is knowledge is disseminated not just through reports and webinars and learning, it's also disseminated through convening and the convening power of connecting people. And I think here AfDB has a very powerful platform, and it does a lot of work in the space to convene. And I like to offer CID as a platform to think about as a convening power here for African member, AfDB member states and organizations as well. Because bringing this knowledge together in different ways, and Niels, you asked about other continental context, and exchanging views in that area can be very, very powerful as well. So those are the three areas that I would emphasize as concrete ways we could instrumentalize creating a new culture of the use of evaluation through identifying and appreciating the wealth of knowledge that already exists. And again, I'm happy to help connect you to over 100 plus faculty doing work in this area in lots of different ways and share. They sent me, I can't tell you, they sent me dozens of pages of examples of the research that they're doing in your countries with partners from your countries. So would love to be able to disseminate and share that knowledge back out to those interested. The training capacity piece, which is so incredibly important, and then the convening power. And I think there's lots of different ways that we can execute on all three fronts. Thank you.
Honorable Jeremy, you would like to continue? What specific challenges do we face? What needs to be paid attention to?
Pour la durabilité de façon générale, nous devons mettre notre attention sur, disons, l'efficacité dans l'utilisation des ressources, parce que c'est ça qui fait problème souvent dans nos gouvernements. Et le rôle que nous jouons beaucoup plus dans ça, c'est au niveau du contrôle de l'action du gouvernement pour pouvoir, disons, apprécier la mise en œuvre des politiques publiques, notamment les ouvrages qui sont mis en œuvre, que ce soit des ouvrages financés par des partenaires au développement, que ce soit des ouvrages financés sur le budget de l'État. Actuellement, au Bénin, il n'y a pas de projet d'un ministère sans la théorie des changements. La seule chose qui manque, c'est que cela se fait à l'interne avec le gouvernement et il faut l'œil des autres acteurs comme le Parlement pour mieux apprécier pour la durabilité des ouvrages. C'est vrai, il y a quelques insuffisances qui ont été notées il y a quelques années, mais depuis, disons, 56 ans et actuellement, un accent particulier est mis sur la durabilité au niveau des ouvrages mise en œuvre dans notre pays. J'ai eu la chance de parcourir un peu l'appréciation de la BAD sur les programmes mis en place dans notre pays. Et j'ai observé quand même qu'il y a des points positifs et des points négatifs. Il y a des points positifs et des points négatifs. Et donc, nous devons tirer le son des points négatifs là pour améliorer, disons, la mise en œuvre de nos infrastructures. J'ai noté dans le rapport de la BAD sur le Bénin qu'en matière de pertinence, de cohérence, d'efficacité et de durabilité, surtout comme c'est de ça qu'il s'agit, moyennement, c'est bon pour tous les projets mis en œuvre et financés par la BAD. C'est au niveau de l'efficacité et de l'efficience que nous avons encore certaines choses à améliorer, à corriger, et soit dans les projets futurs ou les projets qui sont encore en cours de mise en œuvre et qui ne sont pas totalement achevés. Donc, nous tirons très bien leçon de tout ce qui se passe au niveau de la mise en œuvre des infrastructures, que ce soit celles financées par la BAD ou d'autres bailleurs ou financées même sur le budget national. Et nous prendrons en compte toutes ces recommandations-là pour améliorer.
Infrastructure implemented.
Okay, thank you very much, Honorable Jeremy. I didn't have translation for the last minutes, but I think I captured the main issues you raised. And I think you mentioned a number of areas where you believe AfDB could be improved. And I would like to hand over to Walter to maybe respond to that, and maybe in a more general way, give us an indication after so many years of talking about sustainability, what is the bank undertaking currently to maybe make the difference now regarding this issue?
So, Chad, on the issue of sustainability, this is a very important issue. And I think that the bank has made a lot of progress on this particular score, basically through the better design of interventions. Over time, the bank has been able to improve on its design of operations, ensuring that these operations are technically sound, they are financially sound, environmentally sound, and also ensuring that there's a lot of participation in the design of these operations. That increases the chances of sustainability of these projects on the ground. A lot has been done, things to do with ensuring that once operations get into our systems, that they're well prepared, and then after that, then the implementation also, there has been a lot of effort to ensure that during implementation, issues of sustainability are taken on board through various assessments. And I think this is where now evaluation has become very, very important. Not only are we learning important lessons on how we've been able to perform in the past from our project completion reports or other forms of assessment, but we are also getting evidence from stakeholders, from the interaction of stakeholders on how some of these operations are performing. So through a process of learning and taking those lessons on board, I think we have been able to make some headway with the operations. And I think I can assure Honorable that I think we are doing much better than we were able to do some 10 years ago. Thank you.
The last question relating to Côte d'Ivoire is from Blaise Assiflou. In Côte d'Ivoire, in the monitoring and evaluation of major development projects, how does the state proceed? Do we have state entities doing it, or are external or international actors doing the evaluation? When the state is not the evaluator, how does it best exploit these evaluation results to increase intelligence, but also for continuous improvement. And I think this is the last question. Maybe you can be brief and crisp. Thank you.
I just want to say that as regards monitoring and evaluation of projects, actually it's quite similar to other policy frameworks, macroeconomic, sectoral economy. When it is not systematic, sometimes as regards the implementation of the policy, the monitoring and evaluation could be questioned by a partner or by Côte d'Ivoire itself. If it is requested by the partner, we select the body that will be in charge of the evaluation and will proceed to conduct the evaluation, and the outcome findings are going to be shared by the partner in the state. A lot of projects have been evaluated along those lines, and we've had ex ante and ex post evaluations, which has made it possible to improve the implementation of projects. Some donors the systematic evaluation of projects, and it's high, and this is part of the project definitions and project or result evaluations. As regards policies implemented by budgetary resources, of course, there's a framework under which this policy should be evaluated. National bodies work on it, and as I said, the capacity was built, and there is an increasing number of policies being evaluated. Now, in order to institutionalize that, we want to ensure that for any policy, its evaluation should be systematic.
Conçoit la politique dans ce cadre, mais ce qui demande beaucoup plus d'attention que avec le cas favorable, parce que
this will require more time. Both the partner and the government agree, and with the outcome of the law, will have better results than, of course, the state and is always involved to national bodies, work on a regular basis on evaluation, and the parliament is also involved, but they're not equipped enough and do not have enough resources to it. But this is going to be institutionalized by the law in order for all the stakeholders
Thank you very much.
to have enough resources.
Our end of the discussion. Please let me try to maybe not summarize, but to capture some important issues. And I think one you just mentioned, and it was also mentioned by Honorable Jeremy, this is how to institutionalize evaluation in the political systems, and of course, including also the parliamentarian systems. I think we heard about some interesting experiences, how also when evaluation is be institutionalized by laws, that this gives a much better basis and also gives all actors more leverage. I think this is very much related to the issue of political will. Political will not only to institutionalize evaluation, but to use the evidence, to use the results, and to maybe rationalize political decisions by this way. This is, again, very much related what we, I think, learned from Fatima. And this is that we, by institutionalizing evaluation, we need to create a culture for evaluation, which means we need to value knowledge and evidence. We need to build a culture around this. So how to appreciate that, and also to use evidence in time. I think what also, and it was also part of the chat, I think very important is the dissemination of evidence and results. So dissemination into the public, and try to engage via evaluation results and evidence with your stakeholders, so that they are part of the decision-making process, and that stakeholders are involved in decision-making from the very beginning. Also, it was mentioned the need of data collection. I think this is something we are all struggling with throughout our work in many countries. In the board, we have a lot of discussions around gender disaggregated data, which are sometimes not available. So it is difficult to, design bank operations towards addressing the special needs of women. And if we do not start to create these data, I think then we will face challenge on various areas. I think this is more or less what I think we can take with us from this very rich discussion. Please let me extend my sincere thanks, but also the sincere thanks of African Development Bank and our guests for your availability, dear panelists, for this very interesting and very rich discussion. I thank you very much. And as a last remark, I would like to apologize for the IT challenges we faced. I have seen in the chat that obviously there were some problems, and also we in the panel and I myself, we had from time to time challenges, but I think in the end we managed it, and we had a very rich discussion. Thank you very much. And over to Oswald again for the next step of this session. Thank you very much.
Before we end this discussion, dear participants, you may have noted some of the questions that were not answered. We will try our very best to answer these questions and cover all your comments in order to find relevant solutions.